Welcome to this edition of Theological Journal's 4:13 p.m., July 5, 2022. We're in the Anglican Journal talking about Archbishop Mark McDonald and sexual abuse. The title of the article, Sacred Circle Moves to Pick New Archbishop. Sydney Black, interim National Indigenous Bishop. A lot of this has come on short notice. I'm really on a learning curve and trying to understand this whole process. Donna Bomberry, Indigenous elder and consultant. I'm dazed and confused and grieving, but working with others to keep this moving forward. Canon Murray Still. We would, I think, want people to know, support, and love Mark, and our prayers are with him, his family, with the complainant, and with any other survivors of sexual misconduct or abuse anywhere, especially our missing and murdered. Archbishop Linda Nichols, Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. Our hearts hold compassion for the frailty and space for repentance, while we also ache with the pain that such betrayal causes, first to the complainant, then to many others and the life of our church. Mark McDonald, former National Indigenous Bishop. I ask your forgiveness and God's, but will try to live so that there is some repair, whatever may be. The grace of God in you is not even slightly dimmed by the failing that plagues me. We pick up speaking to the Journal in late April. Black said the next gathering of the Sacred Circle was still on for May, though details of the agenda remain to be worked out. A lot of this has come on short notice, Black said. I'm really on a learning curve. I'm just trying to understand the whole process, what has happened. The Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, ACIP, is currently preparing the Covenant and Our Way of Life, founding documents of the self-determining Indigenous Church for Sacred Circle. The process of selecting a new permanent National Indigenous Archbishop, Black said, would be similar to that used for selecting diocesan bishops, with a search committee looking at candidates, followed by an election and consecration. We haven't gone that far, Black said, of the process to find McDonald's successor. We've just been dealing with the reaction of folks to this incident. Former Indigenous Ministries Donna Bomberry, an elder who served as a consultant on the Covenant and Our Way of Life, says, I'm dazed and confused, but working with others to keep this moving forward. They met on April 26 to hold a sharing circle in which members shared their thoughts in the aftermath of the news. The council also began the process of upholding an electoral synod to find a new permanent National Indigenous Bishop. As the story was being written, an in-person sacred gathering was still planned in May or June. ACIP co-chair Murray Still said the sole purpose of that meeting would be to elect a new archbishop, with ratification of the Covenant and Our Way of Life potentially taking the place. We would, I think, want people to know and support Mark, and our prayers are with him, his family, with the complainant, and with any other survivors of sexual misconduct or abuse anywhere, especially our missing and murdered. Still said our prayers are with all of them and their families. It's been a difficult time for us. Still, the ACIP meeting also included plans for Rupert's Land Provincial Synod the following weekend and Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby's visit to Canada. We're looking forward to the provincial synod because we do have a chance to share the story of the covenant and our way of life, and I think that's going to be a positive experience for us. We're looking forward to the Archbishop's visit. A letter by McDonald to the Indigenous peoples of the Anglican Church of Canada was posted on the Anglican Council of Indigenous People Facebook before deleted. In the letter, McDonald says he plans to return to the land and under wise spiritual guidance live my life in penitence with, I hope and pray, the discipline of the gospel. Though he had planned to resign and retire for a long time, McDonald said, present circumstances made it necessary for him to do immediately. Expressed sorrow that his resignation had happened in this manner. Despite my strong hope and faith that you will do better and best without me, I am sad beyond my words to express that this will cause you, any of you, pain. With the grace you've given me, this is not what you deserved. Though I know many will be angry, I fear even more of this will lead to discouragement. No human being is worth that. Over the years, I've been a fortunate recipient of the finest disciplines, relatives, and friends that any human being could ask for. Your inspiration means so much, it deeply grieves me that I've given pain and failure in return. Today, my failure eclipses anything that I have done. They are all that I can see, especially the ways I have hurt people personally. I ask your forgiveness and God's, but will try to live so that there may be some repair. Whatever may be, by the grace of God, is not even slightly dimmed by the failings that plague me. McDonald asked for prayers for his family, for his forgiveness if possible, and for Sacred Circle, that it becomes what it is meant to be. The primate said in her pastoral letter that the Church's prayers, first and foremost, must be for the complainant affected by McDonald's actions. The betrayal of trust by someone in such a prominent role of leadership will require a long road of healing and our constant prayers. She also asked the Church to pray for Black and Akip as they move forward to confirm the covenant and our way of life documents for the Sacred Circle. Finally, Nichols invited Anglicans to hold McDonald and his family in prayer. The ripple effects of this misconduct will be felt throughout the Church, both in Canada and internationally, but most especially within the Sacred Circle and Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples. Nichols said, we mourn with him. I trust that the good work that the Sacred Circle has initiated will continue to deepen and grow. A public announcement posted to the Anglican Church of Canada website reiterated the Church's commitment to ensure that workplaces are free from violence, coercion, discrimination, and sexual harassment, that no one should be subjected to sexual misconduct of any kind, that it deals promptly, seriously, and sympathetically with all complaints of sexual misconduct, and that anyone who holds positions of trust and power in the Church will not take advantage of or abuse that trust. The statement cited a call to human dignity, a declaration of principles adopted by the General Synod in 2001 for protection of parishioners and staff, as well as the Safe Church Charter of the Anglican Communion adopted by the General Synod in 2019. We'll bring that to a close. Return to Trinity Journal. And Derstine's article on the ancient Israelite calendar. Neither the biblical authors nor rabbinic sages cited in the Mishnah or in the Talmud ever contemplated the validity of an invisible astronomical new moon. The ability to calculate lunar conjunctions was a product of the Babylonian astronomers' attainment of the scientific acumen to predict lunar eclipses, 550 BC. The earliest Jewish astronomical work is Enochic astronomical book, a Jewish Palestinian text in Aramaic from the 3rd century BC. The level of astronomical expertise in this work harkens back to much earlier examples in Mesopotamia from the first half of the millennium BC. It fails to reflect developments that occurred in Mesopotamian astronomy from the middle of the first millennium onward, such as the use of mathematical models that enabled the Babylonians to predict the recurrence of eclipses and other heavenly phenomena. From this, recent scholarship has argued that the early Jewish sources did not benefit from refinements in astronomical science in Babylon, and Jewish scholars did not have access to Babylonian centers of higher learning during the second half of the first millennium BC. It is widely conceded that calculation of mean lunar conjunctions played no role in determining Hebrew months prior to the innovation of the fixed calendar in the time of Hillel II, mid-4th century AD. Instead, the sighting of the first evening crescent remained standard practice in most diaspora communities well into the Middle Ages. Vestiges of ancient Israel's celebration of the new moon may linger on in southern Africa. The priests of the Lemba people claim lineage from Israelite stock and believe they migrated to southern Africa via the Arabian desert. A few informed leaders maintain this happened around 586 BC. Magdal Leroux, ethnographer of Lemba, sees a very strong indication of an earlier correlation between the culture of Lemba and that of early Israel. Genetic studies support Lemba's claims to Israelite ancestry. Their Hebraic customs, including circumcision, unclean meat taboos, and their practice for sighting and celebrating the new moon have been retained over many centuries by means of oral tradition. After the first visible crescent is sighted during a distinctive ritual, the Lemba blow horns and trumpets and observe a day of rest, reminiscent of Numbers 10:10 and Amos 8:5. According to Leroux, the specific description of how the actual sighting of the new moon takes place in Lemba culture is unique and is a great contribution to the understanding of this Old Testament custom. Turn now to Anglican Episcopal History. 3 articles. The first article is dealing with the historiographers of Lambeth Conference. In his subsequent study, Anglicanism and the Lambeth Conferences, 1978, Stevenson portrayed Anglicanism as a bridge across theological and national boundaries, but one that maintained a historically rooted tradition. The book's opening chapter was defined by 2 block quotes. The first by J. Armitage Robinson in 1908 underlined the unity between Anglicans in Britain and in the United States, which had been a matter of occasional acrimony in Anglican history. The genius of the Anglican Communion, he argued in a 1948 essay, argued that Anglicanism united many seemingly disparate realities, such as the Protestant need for individual belief, with the Catholic emphasis on the Church as a fundamentally corporate reality. The old via media argument. To a person like me living in India, the Anglican Communion puts me in the full heritage of Catholicism as well as the Protestant tradition. Some smoke going on there. It's perhaps noteworthy that Stevenson quoted only Sambaya's belief in the ecumenical dynamism of the Anglican tradition, what we would call ecumenism's furious running on the hamster wheel, producing little to nothing except happy talk. In his original essay, Sambaya had written that, despite assumptions to the contrary, syncretism might contain a constructive valence whereby a living religion appropriates certain beneficial elements and builds them into a living tissue. He continued, Christianity in the past has taken over Platonism and the philosophy of Aristotle in the course of its growth. As Anglicanism takes deep root in Indian soil, it is hoped that she will judiciously appropriate some of the valuable institutions and ideas in Islam and Hinduism which constitute her natural environment. The second journal article is on Michael Ramsey and the Lambeth Conferences. Viewing these currents together, some of the racial issues of the 1960s, it is possible to characterize the mid-1960s as a moment of turbulence among the worldwide Anglican churches. Talk of crisis is itself not neutral and has the tendency to create or exacerbate that of which it speaks. But there was clearly a distinct change in atmosphere in the councils of the Anglican Communion between the 1958 conference and 1966, where the agenda for 1968 was being set. In 1958, the worldwide church, viewed in aggregate, was growing in number. New provinces were being created in the shape of the executive officer, and new networking bodies mandated in 1958. The Anglican Communion seemed to be fitting itself for a greater role. One of the committees of the 1958 Lambeth Conference had spoken of the truly inspiring structure of a communion which was destined for greater and perhaps more dangerous responsibility, to bring into the world in all its crises a tempered wisdom and spiritual stability. The discussion that came under the heading of mutual responsibility and interdependence after the 1963 Anglican Conference in Toronto seemed to represent the new maturity. Not for nothing did Stephen Bain entitle his 1984 book An Anglican Turning Point. Our third essay is on Anglicanism, the Lambeth Conference, and international relations. It was in the context of the Great War that a new interest in the work of Dutch humanist Hugo Grotius emerged in Britain. This crystallized the creation of the Grotius Society, a meeting place for academics, politicians, and public servants in 1915. There was no reason why an Anglican bishop, too, should not turn up there. At all events, when the bishops came to Lambeth in 1920, Their priorities and perspectives had been sharply redefined. Not least had the public role of the Archbishop of Canterbury grown. Randall Davidson, 1848 to 1930, had become more than ever a presence in Parliament and in private correspondence with the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. He had in May 1915 protested the use of poisonous gas, international conventions, doing so upholding the Fourth Convention of the 1907 Hague Conference. The Lambeth Conference of 1920 now caught Davidson at the peak of his powers. It also shows the discreet organizing presence of the young chaplain that had been recruited on the eve of the war in 1915, the energetic George Kennedy Allen Bell. Quote, Christianity and international relations, especially the League of Nations, close quote, was the first report to be commissioned and received by the 1920 Lambeth Conference. In setting to work with his committee, St. Clair Donaldson remarked, it is not one of these subjects, I imagine, upon which we will find ourselves sharply divided. We know what we want, and the work of the committee will be rather to prepare a campaign than to arrive at a decision. Civilization could not emerge from chaos if the Christian element did not take an immediate and decided lead. He emphasized our faith in the Incarnation engenders in us an instinct of brotherhood which refuses to be confined within national boundaries. The bishops must preach the cause of peace. The public must be roused. In these sentiments, Donaldson found a ready ally in the Chancery Brewster, Bishop of Connecticut, who criticized the nationalism of the United States, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and insisted that Christians must maintain a Christian internationalism. American idealism would yet prevail over isolationism. Strikingly, his speech was punctuated by responses of "hear, hear" across the hall. Pick that up next time as we continue reading in the Standard Bearer, the June edition, dealing with sexual assault and sexual abuse that was handled in the May edition. Another response to Rachel Green Miller's book review. The December 15, 2021 edition of the Standard Bearer carried a positive review of Rachel Green Miller's book, Beyond Authority and Submission, Women and Men in Marriage, Church and Society. On this recommendation, I purchased it and eagerly read it. Unfortunately and surprisingly, the book is a study in how to remove all gender distinctions from the Bible, except for the biologically undeniable fact that only women can give birth, and the scripturally undeniable fact for an author who attends a very conservative church that only men can formally lead in worship. While male headship and female submission in marriage are acknowledged, the book contains not a single explanation that I could find of what this headship and submission should look like in practice, except the seemingly endless list of what it does not look like. The admission that only men can take formal church offices appears similarly arbitrary and contrary to the flow of the whole book, more especially while Miller denies what she considers faulty reasons for restricting church offices to men. She never once positively explains why God chose to create this restriction. One concludes that Miller has no idea. Regarding gender roles in marriage and general society, the book promotes or implies positions incompatible with Scripture, which are far-reaching and almost encompassing when it comes to gender. Masculinity and femininity supposedly have nothing to do with character, but only with biological gender. You're feminine because that is what God made you, and nothing can change that. Every man is masculine, always will be, because God made you a man. Page 149. Apart from giving birth, there appears to be nothing unique in how a mother parents versus how a father parents, leaving the reader to think that once the baby is born, the child is simply parented by two genderless parents instead of a father and mother, who the main breadwinner ought to be in the family, and by implication, who stays at home more with the children as the primary caregiver, is left a matter of complete liberty with no guidance at all. With the exception of only men holding formal church office, the church appears to consist of similarly genderless believers. Woefully lacking in a book that is supposed to be a biblical evaluation of women and men in marriage, church and society, is any positive explanation of any number of key biblical texts. Miller generally spends significant time explaining various things these texts supposedly do not mean, but rarely explains what they actually do mean. I give one example, Ephesians 5:21-22. Wives owe their husbands obedience as if they were soldiers, page 27. But that wives are called to submit to their husbands as unto the Lord, and in everything is not acknowledged, much less explained positively. The husband's role and duties in the immediately following verses are also strangely absent from the book. The one key passage where Miller does attempt to give an alternative positive explanation is God saying that he would make Adam a helpmeet for him. Apparently, helpmeet is better translated necessary ally, page 41. To Miller, Genesis 2:18 does not appear to indicate any difference of role between men and women, but only teaches that men and women are interdependent co-laborers. As such, this book is not a warning against excesses in the complementarian movement, but almost a complete capitulation to feminism and egalitarianism, and an attack on the beautiful complementarity of male and female presented in the Bible. Manuel Cubs of Ballymena, Indiana. Well, he didn't like the book review. Now a response. Thank you for your thoughts in what appears to be a review of your own. In response, I can only offer a few portions of Miller's conclusion here for other readers who may not own the book. Quote, "We've inherited a mixture of good and bad beliefs, particularly about men and women. Much of what it is actually inherited from our Greco-Roman and Victorian ancestors. We've ended up with layers of biblical and extra-biblical beliefs that obscure what the Bible actually teaches. The hyper-focus on authority and submission has done considerable damage. The fixation of authority and submission promotes antagonism and disunity. Authority and submission are important aspects of our relationships, but they shouldn't be the lens through which we view all of life. By moving beyond an exclusive focus on authority and submission, we can incorporate the biblical themes of unity interdependence, and service to Him in our teachings. We were created to be co-laborers together. This is written by Brenda Hoekstra of Hudsonville. We turn now to Table Talk, and this is the June edition. And a weekend devotional for July 30-31. Matthew 9:19-13-15 features the wonderful account of Jesus' welcoming of children and blessing them. The disciples, thinking it beneath our Savior to receive little boys and girls, attempt to turn the children away. Surely they must have been thinking Jesus was too busy and too important to waste his time with children. This is written by Reverend Rothwell, Associate Editor of Table Talk. They believed he had more significant matters to deal with, people of greater influence and power to address. But Jesus did not agree with that assessment. In yet another instance of reframing the disciples' notions of propriety, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." We dare not miss the significance of Jesus' words. If children had no capacity to understand the things of God and the person and teachings of Christ, it would make sense to keep them at arm's length from the Savior until they're old enough to really grasp him. Jesus' welcome of the children implies that our young ones are able to understand and believe the deep truths that he proclaimed. In reality, Jesus is implicitly exhorting us not to underestimate our children and what they are capable of. Anyone who's spent any time talking about the Bible or God or other spiritual matters with kids soon learns that they are actually profound little theologians. Indeed, they are. I am amazed at the questions my 4 children ask. They range in age from 12 to 4, as well as their insights into divine truth. But it's not just my own children. As I've had opportunity over the years to teach Sunday school or sit in on a communicants classes for children as they prepare to take the Lord's Supper, I see the children of other people ask the same kinds of remarkable questions and display a similar breadth of insight. To put it another way, young boys and girls often show more theological understanding than we give them credit for. Sadly, however, we all too often underestimate children. Many churches send the children off to children's worship service during the sermon. The intentions behind this are good, for the practice is driven by the desire to make instruction age appropriate, but it assumes kids are incapable of understanding ordinary sermons. It underestimates the children and divides the corporate setting. To be fair, sometimes this happens because pastors do not take into account the presence of children in their congregation. That too underestimates children, for it misses their need of application to God's Word, to their own lives, and assumes that they are incapable of understanding what is being said. Certainly, there is a place for instruction tailored to younger children and classes specifically for them. Nevertheless, we must be careful not to underestimate our children. Jesus never did. We follow Jesus in loving and helping the kiddos, the grandkiddos. Now for some testimonials, your support at work. Michael from Egypt. The discipleship resources that Ligonier offers are fundamental references in my ministry. Ligonier's teaching series in Arabic are translated, dubbed, and available as written scripts, which is wonderful. I hope you'll continue providing these resources. We are in desperate need of your ministry. Thomas from Paraguay. It's been an immense joy to hold the Reformation Study Bible, Spanish edition, in my hands. I found its study notes, theological articles, and historical creeds and confessions second to none in Spanish. The Reformation Study Bible has become my bedside study Bible. It is like sitting down for coffee with some of the greatest pastors and theologians in the world and rediscovering God's truth. Dariush from Iran. I found 2 books by Dr. Sproul, The Holiness of God and Everyone's Theologian, on Ligonier's Farsi website. Both are very good, things we've never heard before. Everyone's Theologian is the best book on systematic theology ever translated into Farsi. It is very easy to read and understandable. I plan to share it with all our household churches. That's some good news. I've been long wondering about the infiltration and penetration of God's revelation into the Muslim countries. Good report. Your generosity makes it possible to bring trustworthy resources and teaching to people around the world. Thank you for helping in advance to global awakening to the character of God. We will pick that up again as we turn to Bibliotheca Sacra, the March 2021 edition last year, and this is on a chronology of the life of Christ with emphasis on the Nativity and Epiphany. However, this is not to say that the calculation theory is entirely without merit. That early computists and chronographers made at least some calculations of the sort described seems indisputable and may be granted. In fact, we can see the process in motion as early writers tended to place the Annunciation first in Passover season, then on Passover itself, and finally on March 25. However, since the date most early writers assigned for Jesus' birth was the 42nd year of Augustus's reign, 2 BC, and Passover was not on March 25 that year, writers like Hippolytus, who placed Christ's conception on Passover, naturally resisted adopting March 25 for the date of the Annunciation. Typologically, it could be argued that Jesus was conceived on Passover Day, but historically there was no basis to assign that to March 25. For these writers, Passover was the important and controlling factor in searching for the date to assign the Annunciation, not an artificial date in the Julian calendar. However, with time, the symbolism associated with the equinox and solstice and the symmetry thus achieved apparently persuaded men to abandon dates with greater historical and scriptural founding in favor of the triad of Julian dates ostensibly pioneered and proposed by Africanus. We'll pick that article up again as we turn to Modern Reformation, the May-June edition. And this article is on restoring Eve and the discussion of Genesis 3:16 and correlate passages. Who was the ancient Eve? After the climactic note on Adam and he ate, Genesis 3:16 shows us what sin costs. It builds tension in the narrative, leading into what has traditionally been labeled as the curse. For Susan Foe and others, if the woman's desire of Genesis 3:16 is construed as positive or compulsive, that doesn't make sense as a punishment. But perhaps we have too quickly labeled this section the curse, and so missed an important aspect of what's happening at this point in the garden. The curse section begins with a confrontation. The man and woman hear God's approach, and they hide. 3 verse 8. The reader knows what God has said, quote, "In the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of the good and evil, you shall surely die." Adam and Eve are waiting with bated breath, knowing they have disobeyed God's command, and with disobedience comes the covenant curses. God does indeed move on to judgment, but that's not what we expect. The Lord addresses each character in turn. Though his order has been corrupted, God reinstates it as he addresses each party, ending with Adam, the one ultimately held accountable. There are varying explanations for the structure of the curse narrative, 14 to 19, but they all generally affirm the exclusive context of judgment, seeing the section as a list of punishments imposed by God as a result of the man and woman's sin. These are summarized as follows. The serpent will crawl on his belly and eat dust. There will be an enduring battle between the woman and the serpent, verse 15. Women will experience pain in bearing children, verse 16. There will be trouble in the marriage, again, verse 16. Work will be difficult, 18 and 19. And then on top of that, there will be death, verse 19. This death is seen as the fulfillment of God's promised judgment in 2:17. Most explain that God was speaking of immediate spiritual death in 2:17, with the new inevitability of physical death also arising from sin. In surveying this long list of punishments, we can feel the heaviness of judgment, and as an etiology, it certainly serves to explain the difficult conditions of life in the fallen world. It's understandable that Susan Foe and others would conclude that whatever comes from these pronouncements must match the ugliness of sin that has entered the world. Pick that up again. We turn again to Modern Reformation, the July-August edition, Who Says, in Solving Doctrinal Controversies. We start and are continuing a new essay by Dr. Zachary Purvis, Lost and Found, Calvin's Sermons on the Scrap Heap, referring to an 8-volume set of Calvin's sermons found in 1823 in Geneva, in a Geneva bookstore, found by two brothers, William and Adolph Monod. Therefore, Calvin tended to resist the publication of his sermons. Calvin did not want his sermons to extend beyond his sheepfold, acknowledged his contemporary Jacques Roux, both because they were done for his own flock, adjusted as much as possible to their capacity, because he felt that a different order and setup would be needed if the sermons were to be presented to the whole world. Calvin's printer, Conrad Bodius, admitted in 1557 that those sermons had reached print were more the result of a forced and constrained permission, or even as a result of badgering them, than it was out of his free will and consent. The published sermons nonetheless supplied a concrete model of Reformed preaching that carefully related exegesis and reflection, application and edification. Calvin followed a simple homiletical pattern, always a clear understanding of his particular congregants and telling choice of words. For good reason, he had achieved renown in his own time for his method of expository preaching. For good reason, too, he remains one of the great preachers in the history of the Church. Bodies spoke with more wisdom than he probably realized when he began to market Calvin's sermons to young and inexperienced preachers. It is expedient that those who are newly starting in this charge observe his way of teaching in order to follow it. When the Bourse Français eventually required the handwritten sermons to be deposited in Geneva's library, it never foresaw the cruel fate that awaited the material. Librarians are usually the kindest of people, with souls of modesty. But in 1805, the library management directed the librarian, Jean Senebert, to sell some 40 volumes of Calvin's sermons to bookseller Gaspard Joel Manguet for reasons both lamentable and deplorable, if only in hindsight. The library was cramped. The sermons occupied several shelves, and there was an urgent need for more space. Moreover, the librarian thought Ragonier's handwritten pages were doublets, that is, copies that duplicated Calvin's commentaries and published sermons already in the library's possessions. Worst of all, the junk shop later. The library sold the collection by the weight of paper. Like recycled garbage, the sermons were scattered far and wide. Not until 1826 did Geneva's local newspaper break the story that William and Adolphe Monod had found and returned part of what the library had discarded. The new librarian wrote an op-ed to explain what had happened and to place the blame firmly on his predecessor. In response, the newspaper quipped, perhaps it would have been better to let the public believe that Calvin's manuscripts had disappeared than to tell the public that they had, according to a decision, been sold by the weight of paper. Would Muslim leader Caliph Umar have decided otherwise? But all was not lost. Although the transcriptions of Ragonier and his successors in Geneva, several extant manuscripts of Calvin's sermons have subsequently been discovered in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, the Library of Lambeth Palace in London, the Walloon Church in London, and the Public Library and Archive in Bern, Switzerland, among other locations. In the imposing Library of France in Paris, a few of Calvin's sermons have been discovered on sheets of paper, folded in four, coated with finger grease from being consulted so often. Like a detective story, the total history of Calvin's sermons provokes and excites. In reading rooms and niche but fervent corners of academia, speculation on manuscript whereabouts continues, albeit in tones more wishful than confident. Should we despair, the historians ask, or will an unexplored attic one day reveal that for which we've been looking for so long? One or more small folio volumes bound in parchment and bearing a 16th century script, perhaps Ragonier's, the precise indication of Calvin's sermons, which he had faithfully received from his mouth. Scholars rightly want to know, yet one wonders whether Calvin would be pleased by the disappearance. He preached, after all, to a local church, and he insisted more on the power of the eternal word that on the preservation of his own sermons. Calvin's sermons. Now for Calvin, Theological Journal, Gerard Siskar, talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Last talking about the Greek word pentheo, which deals with mourning. He was dealing with the Old Testament idea. In Greek, the word peacemakers, eirene poios, just as in English, is a compound of peace, eirene, and maker, poieo. Eirene in the Septuagint almost exclusively translates the Hebrew word shalom. Shalom is a cognate of the verb shali, to be completed, complete, whole, perfect. The use of eirene in the New Testament stands firmly in the Septuagintal tradition. It is the disenfranchised, contrite, and bereaved who are experiencing an intense loss, sense of loss, helplessness, and despair, that Jesus sends his shalom-making disciples in order to bring them to a state of shalom, which is not merely peace in a strict sense, but contains the sense of completeness or wholeness. Shalom restores them to a place of flourishing and fruitfulness in God's world. Shalom is that state for which God made humans to exist in the beginning. When shalom makers act as the Father whose children they are, and bring restoration to those who mourn what is missing in their lives, those who mourn will be comforted, and there is the kingdom of heaven. While the comfort remains future in its final fulfillment, the coming of Jesus brings the kingdom of heaven for all those who follow him. On another note, there's a subversive undercurrent in this seventh beatitude. During the Pax Romana, who needed peacemakers? Had Caesar not succeeded as the peacemaker? At least subsequent to New Testament times, the term peacemakers was applied to the forceful establishment of peace by rulers. The peace order established by Roman rulers was not interested in restoring wholesomeness to those who did not have it, but in maintaining excess abundance for those who had it. As Klaus Wonks notes, the question whether the period of the Pax Romana between Augustus and the Antonines was a golden age, therefore must be suspended by another simple question: peace for whom? He goes on to quote Tacitus in the Annales. There had been undoubtedly peace, but peace with bloodshed. Wonks rightly concludes that this Roman notion of peace would be challenged by its victims. And we'll end this session of Theological Journals, Part 1 here. Godspeed.